Welcome, dear listener, as we gently turn the pages of history to explore a life that, despite its later complexities, began in quiet stillness. Tonight, we'll ease into the story of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, a name that echoes with profound thought, yet whose early days were filled with the serene experiences that shape any young soul. Let us journey back to a small Prussian village, a place of peace and early dreams. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche came into the world on a cool autumn day, the 15th of October in the year 1844, in the tranquil village of Röcken. This was nestled near the town of Lützen, in what was then known as the Kingdom of Prussia. It was a lovely coincidence that he shared his birthday with King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, and so he was given the king's name, a gentle touch of destiny in his quiet arrival. His father, Ludwig Nietzsche, was a kind, respected Lutheran priest, serving the local church. He was 31 years old when Friedrich was born. Ludwig had received his religious education at the esteemed University of Halle, and before settling in Röcken, he had spent 7 years as a private tutor, guiding the 3 daughters of Duke Joseph of Saxe-Altenburg. The Duke himself was a man of history, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, a distant echo of grander times. In 1842, soon after taking up his post in Röcken, Ludwig met a young woman named Franziska Oehler, just 17 at the time. Their connection blossomed, and they married the following October, on Ludwig's own 30th birthday. Franziska, the daughter of the priest from the nearby parish of Pobles, was 19 when she gave birth to Friedrich. Their family grew further with a daughter, Elisabeth, born in 1846, and a son, Ludwig Joseph, who arrived 2 years later. Friedrich's earliest memories were often filled with the presence of his father, a figure much esteemed within their community. Their home was a scholarly haven, and little Friedrich delighted in playing amongst the proudly displayed books in his father's study, perhaps sensing, even then, the quiet power held within their pages. It was an idyllic existence, peaceful and contemplative. Yet, this calm would soon be touched by the distant stirrings of the revolutions of 1848, which swept across the European continent that spring and summer. The Nietzsche family, being conservative in their views, observed with dismay as the King of Prussia was compelled to yield to some of the demands of the revolutionaries. However, more personal sorrows soon gathered for the family. Just a few months later, Friedrich's father began to suffer from a series of mysterious seizures, which doctors could not explain. Tragically, he passed away in July of 1849. Then, a few months later, in January of 1850, another tender life was lost when Friedrich's younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, died, just weeks before his 2nd birthday. These were profound losses that cast a long, quiet shadow over the young Friedrich's tender years. After these 2 deep sorrows, Friedrich, his mother, and his sister Elisabeth moved to the nearby town of Naumburg. Here they found comfort in the presence of his paternal grandmother, Erdmuth, and 2 aunts. Young Friedrich, then only 5 years old and affectionately nicknamed Fritz, initially found the transition to a more urban life in Naumburg a little challenging, but soon new routines began to form. In 1851 he started receiving lessons from a kind priest in training named Weber. He also found companionship, forming close friendships with 2 classmates, Wilhelm Pinder, who lived in one of the town's most distinguished houses, and Wilhelm's cousin, Gustav Krug, the son of a prominent local official and an accomplished musician. These friendships would prove to be enduring, weaving threads of connection through his life. By October of 1854, a 10-year-old Fritz and his friends were admitted to the Cathedral High School. 2 years later, the Nietzsche family moved into a larger house, a space that offered new possibilities. With a new piano now at his disposal, Fritz began receiving lessons from a local chormaster, and it quickly became apparent that he possessed a genuine talent for music, a passion that would resonate through his entire life. In October of 1857, not long after his 13th birthday, a new challenge arose as Friedrich began to suffer from serious headaches, a precursor to the persistent health struggles he would face. His mother, concerned for his well-being, took him out of school until he had recovered. By the time he returned in early 1858, his creative spirit was already stirring, and he had written 2 short plays. His literary pursuits continued later that year during a visit to his maternal relatives at Pobles. There he penned a brief autobiographical account of his young life, including tender, idyllic reminiscences of his father's house in Röcken, capturing the lingering warmth of those early memories. At just 13, the young Nietzsche also offered his thoughts on music, defending the classical tradition of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, believing it leads our thoughts to higher things. He gently dismissed the music of contemporary romantic composers such as Liszt and Berlioz, describing it as decadent and of limited cultural value, as it seemed to him to be used solely for enjoyment, or to make a public exhibition of itself. Though he would later spend his adult life challenging such moral perspectives, even then, the teenage Nietzsche was already displaying the literary talent and discerning eye that would mark him as a profound writer and thinker. In September of 1858, shortly after his return to Nuremberg, a significant opportunity arrived: a scholarship to study at the prestigious Pforte boarding school, located west of Nuremberg. The curriculum there was typical of the 19th century, focusing deeply on classical languages, including Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Despite a demanding timetable of 10 hours of study each day, Nietzsche adapted quickly. He found solace in the school's relative proximity to Nuremberg, which allowed him to meet his family regularly. However, he felt the separation from his dear friends Wilhelm and Gustav, who continued their studies in town. During his summer break in July of 1859, a memorable visit to the university town of Jena offered new horizons. Upon his return to Pforte in August, he excelled, finishing at the top of his class in his exams. Yet, the year was tinged with sorrow, as it was marked by the death of his 72-year-old grandfather, David Oehler, which led his maternal relatives to move away from Pobles. In the summer of 1860, a creative bond was formalized when Nietzsche, Wilhelm Pinder, and Gustav Krug formed a 3-man literary society they named Germania. They agreed to meet regularly, sharing and discussing their musical and literary creations. As part of this shared endeavor, Nietzsche began composing a Christmas oratorio. In November, he received a lengthy letter from Krug, filled with praise for Richard Wagner's opera, Tristan und Isolde. This was a tempestuous 5-hour spectacle, rooted in Arthurian legend, which had not yet been performed, but whose musical scores were already circulating and being analyzed by critics. For the time being, Nietzsche did not share his friend's fervent enthusiasm for Wagner's work, though this sentiment would, in time, gently shift. He continued to work on his oratorio, but once again his persistent migraines returned. Over the course of 1861, he also began to drift, subtly, towards the music of Liszt, which he had earlier dismissed as sinful, and found himself drawn to the rich tapestries of Slavic and Hungarian folklore. This year, 1861, also proved transformative for Nietzsche's burgeoning thoughts on history and literature. For school, he penned a provocative essay defending Friedrich Hölderlin, a poet and philosopher who contrasted German barbarism with the luminous achievements of classical antiquity, and who had openly supported the French Revolution. Elsewhere, Nietzsche found inspiration in the English poet Lord Byron, particularly in his superhuman romantic hero, Manfred. Far more controversial, however, was an essay he composed around this time, offering support for Napoleon III, the Emperor of the French, and a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose armies had, a half-century earlier, inflicted so much devastation on Germany. Nietzsche's text drew criticism from both his friends, an early quiet sign of Friedrich's willingness to court controversy and challenge prevailing opinions in his writing. In the period that followed, Nietzsche's creativity deepened, and his thinking continued to evolve. In an essay titled Fate and History, he came to a quiet realization: an individual who is theoretically free is in fact often obeying a wide range of customs and traditions ingrained in them from childhood, which he termed fate. For Nietzsche, an individual who aspired to be truly free had to constantly gently battle against these ingrained constraints. This quiet realization led him to begin questioning his Christian upbringing, marking the subtle beginning of Nietzsche's lifelong quest to break free from what he perceived as the chains of Christian morality. Despite frequent bouts of poor health and persistent headaches, Nietzsche continued to find academic success at Pforta. By the autumn of 1862, he was finally ready to embrace Wagner's music. The Germania Society had acquired a copy of the score of Tristan und Isolde. Sitting at his piano, Nietzsche valiantly joined Krug in exploring the opera. Nietzsche was so profoundly impressed that he took the score with him back to Pforta, quite deaf to Krug's gentle complaints that it had been his idea to purchase it. In his efforts to gently push against the established rules around him, Nietzsche had begun joining his classmates in smoking and drinking. However, in the spring of 1863, a teacher encountered him and a friend returning to school from a drunken evening, an incident that resulted in him being moved back a semester. His increasing pursuit of his literary interests also led to a dip in his grades, and he only just managed to pass his final exams in the late summer of 1864. While his friends Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug went on to university at Heidelberg, Nietzsche, perhaps still wrestling with earlier influences, opted to study theology at Bonn, despite his growing religious pessimism. Nietzsche arrived at Bonn in October, accompanied by his Pforta classmate Paul Deussen, who would later become a renowned Sanskrit scholar. Here he attended lectures by the preeminent philologists Otto Jahn and Friedrich Nietzsche. Philology, a field considered relatively arcane today, was in the 19th century at the cutting edge of European scholarship. As a discipline, it gently weaves together literary criticism with the meticulous analysis of texts and languages, all within a rich historical framework. It's important to bear this in mind, as most contemporaries considered Nietzsche to be primarily a philologist rather than a philosopher, as he is more often remembered today. Indeed, much of his earlier work falls very clearly into the realm of philology. When he returned to Nuremberg for the Easter holidays in 1865, Nietzsche gently yet firmly shocked his mother by informing her that he was no longer planning to become a priest. His growing interest in philology had quietly illuminated for him how myths come into being, and he increasingly recognized that the early Christians had, in a similar fashion, transformed the historical Jesus of Nazareth into a divine figure. Supporting his arguments with a copy of David Strauss's seminal Life of Jesus, published back in 1835, which attributed the Gospels in the Bible to early Christians several decades after Jesus' death. Nietzsche stubbornly yet calmly resisted his family's efforts to persuade him to return to theology. Upon his return to Bonn, he formally transferred to the Faculty of Philology, following his true intellectual calling. Nietzsche soon decided that Bonn was not quite the right fit for him, and chose to transfer to the University of Leipzig, closer to his native Saxony. Aside from financial considerations, Nietzsche had made this decision to follow his esteemed mentor, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had recently been recruited by Leipzig. Soon after his arrival in Leipzig in October 1865, the 21-year-old Nietzsche made a profound discovery, the work of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer would become the greatest single influence on his thinking. In his book The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer built upon the work of his great predecessor, Immanuel Kant, arguing that the empirical world we perceive is merely a representation constructed from our sensual perceptions. The true world, he posited, was defined by an unknowable, pervasive will that existed among all living beings. In his efforts to understand this enigmatic force, Schopenhauer in a way anticipated Darwin, recognizing that nature was a quiet struggle for survival. Although humans had achieved a dominant position in nature through superior intellect, Schopenhauer pessimistically viewed the human will as one that relentlessly pursues its desires, only to encounter boredom and dissatisfaction once those desires are attained. The only serene escape from the suffering of the human condition, he suggested, was to appreciate the wonders of nature and the solace of art. In early 1866, Nietzsche continued his intellectual pursuits by founding a philological club and presenting a paper that quietly caught the attention of Professor Ritschl, who, impressed, offered to support him in getting his work published. At this time, Saxony found itself gently drawn into a wider conflict, a war between Prussia, the dominant power in northern Germany, and the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the largest German region in the south of Central Europe. After the Prussians won a decisive victory at Königgrätz in July, Prussia extended its influence, and Saxony effectively became a Prussian protectorate. Notwithstanding his academic successes, in September of 1867, Nietzsche found himself swept up in the German patriotic fervor and enlisted in an artillery regiment. In March of 1868, he was badly injured after falling from his horse. He wisely took advantage of his recovery period to quietly work on his academic contributions. Shortly before entering military service, he had written a prize-winning essay on the 3rd century AD Greek historian and biographer of ancient philosophers, Diogenes Laertius. Laertius remains our foremost source for the intimate details of the lives of many of the ancient world's most important thinkers, men such as Zeno of Citium, the quiet founder of the school of philosophy known as Stoicism. Nietzsche's essay on Laertius was subsequently published in a prestigious journal, edited by Ritschl, who would accept 2 more of Nietzsche's insightful contributions in 1868. At just 24 years of age, Nietzsche was firmly on the path to academic renown when he returned to Leipzig in October of 1868 after his military service. Following a gentle introduction from a friend on the 8th of November, Nietzsche was invited to a private gathering to meet one of his idols, Richard Wagner. After Wagner graciously entertained his small audience by playing extracts from his operas, he and Nietzsche found themselves in a deep discussion about philosophy. Nietzsche was delighted to hear that his favorite composer was also an enthusiastic admirer of Schopenhauer. At the end of the meeting, Wagner extended a warm invitation to Nietzsche to visit him at his home in Lucerne, Switzerland, to continue their stimulating discussions. As fate would have it, not long afterwards, Nietzsche received an astonishing offer to take up a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Motivated by the generous salary of 3,000 Swiss francs a year, Nietzsche left for the Alpine country in March of 1869, accepting a professorship without even having completed his university degree. Clearly, his early published work had profoundly convinced his new departmental colleagues in Basel that this young man was truly worth hiring, degree or no degree. While he quietly struggled with being away from his friends and family in Germany, Nietzsche made frequent, peaceful trips to Wagner's villa at Tribschen, nestled on the shores of Lake Lucerne, after arriving in Switzerland. There, he cultivated good relations with Wagner's mistress and future wife Cosima von Bülow, the daughter of the renowned Franz Liszt. He would later praise Cosima as a model of womanhood. Nietzsche felt glad to become part of his idol's intimate circle, at a time when Wagner was deeply immersed in working on Siegfried, the 3rd part of his epic Ring cycle, based on rich Germanic mythology. In turn, the composer greatly appreciated the young philologist's profound interest in his work. After spending a joyful Christmas with the Wagners, Nietzsche delivered two quietly controversial lectures in early 1870. In these, he gently argued that the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, a revered figure in the canon of Western philosophy, was in part responsible for the perceived degeneration of Greek culture from its earlier heights of epic poetry and tragedy. He would soon expand upon these ideas, contending that classical Greek culture was actually at its pinnacle in the 6th and early 5th centuries BC, and that figures like Socrates in the late 5th century BC, with what Nietzsche viewed as a rather simplistic philosophical approach, represented a subtle decline. In April of 1870, Nietzsche had his post at Basel confirmed as a permanent one, but his joy was somewhat short-lived after learning that he would be teaching 20 hours a week, a demanding schedule that would leave little precious time for his own research and writing. He received a further, quiet shock. A few weeks later, when Wagner informed his close friends that he intended to move away from Tribschen to manage his own opera theatre at Bayreuth in Bavaria under the generous patronage of his admirer King Ludwig II. There, Wagner hoped to stage his ring cycle with musicians specifically trained under his direction. A disconsolate Nietzsche quietly wrote to Cosima, suggesting that he might leave his academic post after a year or two and follow Wagner to Bayreuth. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's life was further disrupted when Napoleon III of France declared war on Prussia in July of 1870. After spending his summer holiday with the Wagners, he obtained leave from the university to serve as a medical orderly in eastern France, arriving at the headquarters of the Prussian Southern Army at Nancy in Lorraine just before the Prussians decisively defeated the French at Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870. Although the Franco-Prussian War was a short one, ending swiftly in January of 1871 with the unification of the German Empire under Prussian domination, a move orchestrated by the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Nietzsche's views on it quietly evolved during the few short months of the conflict. This was due in part to his contracting both diphtheria and dysentery during his time as a medical orderly, conditions which further damaged his always precarious health. As a result, he took a dimmer, more somber view of the Prussian aggression by the time the war came to an end. During the winter of 1870, while recovering from his ailments, he began to make quiet plans to move away from his sharp focus on philology in favor of studying philosophy more directly. After a joyful Christmas holiday, during which he had the privilege of witnessing Wagner perform his Siegfried Idyll as a surprise birthday gift for Cosima, Nietzsche sank into a gentle depression when several friends, regrettably, refused to join him in Basel. Further disappointment followed when Nietzsche's request to take over the chair of philosophy in the university was, unfortunately, denied. While gently recovering his health in Lugano, in Italian Switzerland, Nietzsche immersed himself in a study of Greek tragedy, which eventually blossomed into a book titled The Birth of Tragedy, published in December of 1871. In this work, Nietzsche identified within Greek tragedy a profound struggle between what he termed Apollonian and Dionysian forces, the former representing order, reason, and serene beauty, and the latter embodying chaos, emotion, and intoxicating passion. These forces, he observed, were beautifully manifested in the cults of Apollo, the Greek god of music and dance, and Dionysius, the Greek god of wine, excess, ecstasy, and glorious madness. Nietzsche perceived music as the highest, most pure representation of the Dionysian concept, and he thoughtfully speculated that the epic poetry of ancient Greece had been, at its heart, inspired by music itself. The book was lovingly dedicated to Wagner, whom Nietzsche argued had emulated the Greek tragedians in achieving a perfect harmonious balance of Apollonian and Dionysian elements in his own work. The composer was utterly delighted with Nietzsche's work, and enthusiastically asked the author to send copies to his patron, King Ludwig of Bavaria, and his father-in-law, Franz Liszt. Although the book proved popular among artists and musicians, the academic community was less enamored by Nietzsche's imaginative conjectural approach to philology, and Nietzsche was gently disappointed to find his esteemed mentor, Friedrich Nietzsche, among the critics. That said, any reader of The Birth of Tragedy today will discover a refreshingly novel insight into classical Greek culture. Nietzsche was already, by the early 1870s, very much carving out his own distinctive path when it came to his quiet, yet profound interpretations. Nietzsche, alongside Wagner, envisioned themselves as the gentle vanguard of a movement, striving to return German culture to the lofty heights it had attained at the turn of the 19th century, the glorious era of Kant, Mozart, Goethe, and Beethoven. In early 1872, he delivered a series of public lectures, calmly yet sharply, attacking the German education system and warning against what he saw as a worrying trend towards the democratization of education. While he acknowledged a practical need for the training of state officials, farmers, and factory workers, he gently argued that cultural education and pure intellectualism were being denigrated by making them overly functional, with the sole goal that individuals should always be training for a profession, rather than engaging in scholarship as a beautiful end in and of itself. In May he journeyed to Bayreuth to attend a ceremony marking the laying down of the foundation stone of Wagner's new theatre, an edifice built precisely to the composer's grand specifications. Back in Basel, Nietzsche soon found himself at the center of a gentle, yet sometimes fierce debate playing out in the pages of the national newspapers about the merits of his book The Birth of Tragedy. While he appreciated the publicity, he realized that most of his fellow philologists were quietly against him. After spending his summer holidays in Italy, Nietzsche returned to Basel to find that only 2 students had signed up for his course on Greek and Roman rhetoric. He was reluctantly forced to abandon a second lecture course on Homer altogether. Unperturbed by these academic challenges, Nietzsche now decided to dedicate himself to a study of pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, which he quietly hoped to publish under the title Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, in time for Wagner's 60th birthday in May of 1873. When he visited the Wagners in early April in Bayreuth to inspect the ongoing construction work on the theatre, Nietzsche's reading from his latest work received a somewhat cool reception, and his efforts to lighten the mood by playing one of his own compositions on the piano were likewise received with awkward silence. By early May, Nietzsche had almost completed his new book when he became gently distracted by the publication of The Old and New Faith by David Strauss, the very writer whose Life of Jesus had originally inspired Nietzsche to relinquish his path towards religion. Now 4 decades after the Life of Jesus had first appeared, Strauss's latest work set forth a vision of progressive Christianity that quite dismissively labeled Schopenhauer's pessimistic diagnosis of the human condition as the product of a, quote, putrefying brain. Nietzsche was infuriated by this, and swiftly wrote a polemical essay, quietly targeting Strauss as the representative of a contemporary cultural Philistinism in Germany that had ceased seeking truth and beauty, and instead looked only for easy and comfortable answers. This thoughtful polemic of Nietzsche's against Strauss was the first in a series of 4 essays which would eventually be published together in 1876 under the serene title Untimely Meditations. In the next installment, under the heading On the Use and Abuse of History for Life, Nietzsche gently argued that it was indeed worthwhile studying the past, as a reminder that it was possible for humanity to achieve greatness. However, he softly warned against hero worship and myth-making, suggesting that periodically, the past should be re-examined with an eye towards the future. Nietzsche then proceeded to critique the overly scientific approach to history prevalent in Germany, which he felt served to undermine the true power and inspiration of the past. In another essay from this time, entitled Schopenhauer as Educator, he praised the manner in which Schopenhauer sought to gently liberate his readers from convention. It certainly influenced Nietzsche, for he was nothing if not original in his deeply considered views. For the fourth of his untimely meditations, Nietzsche turned his quiet attention to art with a piece entitled Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. Although he had written most of it by early 1875, he was once again struck down by ill health that would cruelly leave him almost blind. Scholars have debated what afflicted Nietzsche for well over a century. Many have quietly concluded that he was suffering from tertiary syphilis, but it may have been a number of different ailments that gradually worsened over time, notably gastric spasms, hemorrhoids, debilitating headaches, failing eyesight, and eventually fits and fainting spells. Some have speculated that these myriad neurological issues might indicate the gradual development of a brain tumor. It was not until July of 1876 that Nietzsche recovered enough from this latest bout of ill health that he managed to complete the manuscript of Richard Wagner in Bayreuth with the gentle assistance of a young musician and admirer named Heinrich Koselitz. Copies were immediately sent out to Wagner, who urged Nietzsche to hurry to Bayreuth to attend the final rehearsals in advance of the premiere of the Ring Cycle in mid-August. Nietzsche arrived there by the 22nd of July, but found the town bustling with aristocrats, who seemed to be there more for the social occasion than for any particular appreciation of Wagner's profound work. Keen to escape the crowds, Nietzsche politely refused an invitation to meet the King of Bavaria. The University of Basel now kindly granted Nietzsche a year-long sabbatical. He spent the first part of it in the gentle warmth of Italy, with Malwida von Meisenbug, a German aristocrat who had turned her back on her family and befriended several prominent European revolutionaries. She was an enthusiastic admirer of both Wagner and Nietzsche's work. Although Meisenbug was 28 years Nietzsche's senior, she became one of his closest confidants after their first meeting in Munich several years earlier. Nietzsche traveled to Sorrento, in the beautiful Bay of Naples, with two companions, Albert Brenner and Dr. Paul Ray, both of whom had previously been his students. Under Ray's quiet influence, Nietzsche found himself gently questioning Schopenhauer's more pessimistic writings. He also became embroiled in a subtle disagreement with Wagner at this time, whose German nationalism Nietzsche was increasingly critical of. Aside from any philosophical disagreements, Wagner knew that his ambitions for Nietzsche to edit a journal to promote his ideas about music and art were unlikely to be realized, given Nietzsche's increasingly poor health. Following his return to Basel in the autumn of 1877, Nietzsche journeyed to Dr. Otto Eiser in Frankfurt for a medical examination. The doctor diagnosed a damaged optic nerve as the source of his failing eyesight and prescribed his patient, quote, an absolute avoidance of reading and writing for years to come. This was an instruction Nietzsche was never going to even remotely consider following. During his sabbatical, Nietzsche had been quietly working on a fifth untimely meditation about the human condition, but by the time the manuscript was completed, it had grown into a separate book of more than 300 pages under the significant title, Human, All Too Human. This was published in the spring of 1878, composed of a series of 638 aphorisms, intended to communicate his thoughts concisely, if not always systematically. Nietzsche gently argued that there were no eternal truths, and that the earnest efforts of Kant and Schopenhauer to discover such truths were fundamentally misguided. In a dramatic reversal of his earlier views, Nietzsche now placed science on a higher level than art, arguing that small scientific discoveries had done much to quietly advance human progress. While Nietzsche continued to acknowledge the importance of art, he described it as a bridge, a gentle transition to facilitate the movement from religion and superstition to his free-spirited way of thinking. Indeed, the subtitle of the book was A Book for Free Spirits. Elsewhere in the book, he continued his relentless yet calm attack on Christianity by asserting that its core precepts had no rational and scientific basis, and that its notions of good and evil were merely social constructs, which had no place in the modern world. Nietzsche knew that his new book would infuriate Wagner, and thus chose not to send him a copy. Later, he heard from his and Wagner's publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner, that the composer had acquired a copy of the book, but did not read much of it before setting it aside. So as not to disturb the positive impression he still held of Nietzsche's earlier work. Many of Nietzsche's friends were equally critical after reading the book, and were especially troubled by his gentle, yet firm rejection of conventional morality. In response to his critics, Nietzsche quietly doubled down by writing a second part, subtitled Mixed Opinions and Maxims, offering another 400-odd aphorisms, in which he argued that Christian humility and self-denial were in fact a subtle manifestation of a self-centered desire to avoid eternal damnation, and that Christianity was in essence a cult of suffering. Nietzsche's deteriorating health prompted him to request to be relieved of his duties at the University of Basel in May of 1879. By now in his mid-30s, his thinking had evolved considerably during his years at Basel. However, over the course of the next decade, he would have to quietly eke out an existence as an independent philosopher, supported by a pension of 3,000 Swiss francs a year from the university, and occasional financial assistance from friends and family. Yet, despite his poor health, and the way his work in the 1870s had strongly divided opinion, Nietzsche was about to embark on what would prove to be the most productive period of his life. The liberation from his academic duties, paradoxically, freed him to research and write to an unprecedented extent. By the autumn of 1879, he had already put together another collection of free-thinking aphorisms entitled The Wanderer and His Shadow. In this, Nietzsche gently denounced the promotion of abstract concepts such as the salvation of the soul, arguing that human beings should not be troubled by metaphysical considerations. Addressing an age-old question about the state of nature, he quietly attacked Jean-Jacques Rousseau's notion that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains, arguing instead that rather than voluntarily giving up part of their freedoms for the social good, human communities evolved in response to external threats, and the earliest forms of justice were no more than legalized systems of revenge. By giving his book the title The Wanderer and His Shadow, Nietzsche used his aphorisms to explore both the positive and negative aspects of the same issue. For instance, addressing the impacts of war, Nietzsche asserted that while war was clearly a destructive force, it can also provide the necessary catalyst to rejuvenate stagnant communities and resolve long-standing tensions within them. These views were often controversial, but many of the ideas outlined in The Wanderer and His Shadow are now widely incorporated into the field of anthropology and the study of early human societies. The winter of 1879 proved disastrous for Nietzsche's health, and he spent 1880 quietly on the move, seeking more amenable climates. In February of 1880, he journeyed to the northern Italian lakes, where he met up with Heinrich Köselitz and accompanied him to the serene city of Venice. Nietzsche found great enjoyment in Venice in the company of his young friend, whose support in transcribing Nietzsche's barely legible drafts into a fine, clear copy proved indispensable. However, the summer heat compelled him to move to the fashionable spa town of Marienbad, now in the Czech Republic. After returning to Nuremberg in September, he went back to Italy in October to preempt the onset of winter and settled down in Genoa. Here, Nietzsche was prodigiously busy, and by February of 1881, he had completed his draft of Morgenröte, or Morning Glow, which was published in June. While Nietzsche held high hopes for the book, it would prove to be one of his lesser-known works, though it allowed him to further develop his ideas about Christianity's perceived harmful impact on human development, while also expressing his quiet appreciation for Eastern religions, in particular Buddhism, which had largely cast aside the need for gods in favor of a quest for the spiritual fulfillment of the individual. January of 1882 saw Nietzsche in unusually good health, and he was glad to have the company of Paul Rée, who had brought a typewriter with him to help Nietzsche with his work. Typewriters had only really become commercially available from the late 1860s onwards, and Nietzsche, who was trying to use one in a sustained manner for the first time, initially struggled to operate the machine, straining his eyes to make sure that he was pressing the right key. Now in his late 30s, Nietzsche made the light-hearted suggestion that he might need a wife, a subject that he had occasionally discussed before with Paul Rée and Malwida von Meisenbug during their time in Sorrento. After spending 5 weeks in Genoa with Nietzsche, Rée continued his journey to Rome to stay with Meisenbug. In her salon, he encountered Lou Salome, a 21-year-old Russian-born poet, whose iconoclastic opinions reflected her disillusionment at the religious and moral instruction she had received as a student of theology. Rée insisted that Nietzsche ought to meet this extraordinary prodigy, and after a brief stay in Messina in Sicily, Nietzsche arrived in Rome in mid-April. In spite of their rather awkward initial encounters in Rome, Nietzsche was soon profoundly impressed by Salome's sharp intellect. In Salome, Nietzsche believed that he had found a young female disciple who could gracefully support his work. Although Salome later claimed that Nietzsche had proposed to her during a third meeting in Lucerne in early May, Nietzsche insisted that he was only after intellectual companionship, in contrast to Rée, who addressed incessant letters to her in distinctly romantic terms. In a plan subtly devised by Salome, the three intended to live together in a philosophical commune in Vienna. To his skeptical friends, Nietzsche declared his intention to train Salome as his intellectual successor and preemptively denied that he had any romantic interest in her. Nietzsche had arranged for his sister Elisabeth and Salome to meet in Bayreuth in July for a performance of Wagner's opera Parsifal, based on the Arthurian knight Percival's quest for the Holy Grail, an opera which Nietzsche quietly detested due to its pronounced Christian inspiration. Despite their outward display of friendship, Elisabeth Nietzsche was, deep down, quite irritated by the young Russian. In the meantime, Nietzsche had added to his body of work with Joyous Science, in which he gently endorsed Charles Darwin's views on biological evolution, which was still enormously controversial over 20 years after The Origin of Species had first been published. At the same time, Nietzsche thoughtfully challenged the strict Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest. Following this logic, the sole purpose of humans and all other animals was merely to survive. But Nietzsche observed that many individuals who had made the greatest contributions to human culture, such as the Renaissance artist Raphael, or the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, had died young without leaving any heirs. Nietzsche argued that human existence was both comic and tragic. The comic aspect was due to the vanity of short-lived humans who believed that they could master nature, while the tragic element came from the quiet, humbling recognition that humans are an infinitesimally small part of the vast cosmos. Near the end of the book, Nietzsche issued a soft call to his readers to wage an intellectual war on behalf of science against religion. Joyous Science is a peculiar work in many ways, one which tried to apply the evolutionary biology of Darwin to a new, nuanced theory of cultural evolution. Although Nietzsche had titled his book Joyous Science, he quietly concluded that the tragic aspects of human existence would always ultimately prevail. Nevertheless, his encounters with Lou Salome had inspired within him a renewed sense of optimism about life. In August of 1882, the two spent 3 tranquil weeks in philosophical discussions in the Teutoburg forest in Saxony, a time which Nietzsche hailed as one of the happiest of his life. Arguments did, however, occur with his sister and mother about the propriety of his relationship with Salome, which led Nietzsche to leave Nuremberg for Leipzig. The already precarious foundations of his triangular relationship began to gently crumble, as a jealous Ray resented Nietzsche's insistence on spending time alone with Salome, while the young and strong-minded Russian had no intention of submitting herself to Nietzsche's intellectual control. Nietzsche also admitted privately in his notebooks around this time that his desire for Salome had assumed a physical dimension. He was consequently immensely upset when the relationship between them all began to collapse in the quiet weeks that followed. Plunged into a deep depression and resorting to taking growing quantities of opium to treat both his physical ailments and his profound emotional pain, Nietzsche continued an acrimonious correspondence in the months that followed with his erstwhile companions from his peaceful retreat at Rapallo in Italy, all to no avail, as they sadly drifted apart. As emotionally turbulent a period as this was for Nietzsche, it proved an intellectually productive one, as he began working on what is often deemed to be his most important work. Thus spake Zarathustra. In this he sought to establish a new philosophical framework of his own, independent of the direct influence of Schopenhauer, Kant, or any other philosopher. This singularly Nietzschean philosophy was expressed via the mouthpiece of the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster, who gave his name to Zoroastrianism, the world's first monotheistic faith, one which had flourished in Mesopotamia and Persia in the first millennium BC, and in which the creator god Ahura Mazda was involved in an eternal struggle with the demon Ahriman. Although Nietzsche rejected the dichotomy of good and evil introduced by Zoroastrianism, one which had clearly influenced the development of Christianity, he saw Zoroaster as a prophet who had challenged the status quo, hence his motives for expressing some of his own philosophical ideas through the mouthpiece of the Persian prophet. Nietzsche wrote the first part of Zarathustra within the space of just 10 days in late January of 1883. A couple of weeks later, he learned that Richard Wagner had died unexpectedly in Venice. They had not seen each other in over 6 years after an acrimonious divergence of views in the mid-1870s, though Nietzsche continued to quietly revere elements of the great composer's work. During a visit to Rome in April of 1883, Nietzsche gently reconciled with his sister Elisabeth, whom he had earlier blamed for the wrecking of his plans with Salome. By June he was back at his favorite Swiss mountain retreat of Sils Maria, where he expressed his anger at his Leipzig publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner, for delaying the publication of the first part of Zarathustra. Nietzsche quietly speculated that Zoroaster's declaration in the book that, quote, "God is dead," surely one of the most famous lines of modern philosophy, had led Schmeitzner's printer to sit on the manuscript and delay its publication. The text was paradoxical. On the one hand, Nietzsche argued that the advent of science and modernity was leading to a growing secularism, one which would eventually lead to the symbolic death of Christianity. Yet on the other hand, Zarathustra is evidently framed in the text as a parallel to Jesus Christ, and Nietzsche even referred to his book as a fifth gospel. These beautiful contradictions can be explained when we see that Nietzsche was arguing that man was now moving to a new stage of evolution after the religiosity of the past, one in which a new Übermensch, an overman or superman, one based on rationality, and a higher culture, would gently emerge. By July, Nietzsche had completed the second part of Zarathustra, consisting of 22 further discourses in which he went further than ever in denouncing the perceived hypocrisy of Christians seeking self-negating virtuousness for the sake of a heavenly kingdom. Nietzsche began to develop the idea of the will to power, subtly substituting Schopenhauer's image of nature as a struggle for survival with a deeper struggle for mastery. arguing that no relationship between two humans is without a gentle desire to gain a measure of influence or control over the other. As he elaborated on the concept, Nietzsche argued that Christianity had only been able to succeed because the emperors at the heart of the Roman Empire had realized in the 4th century that adopting the new religion served their material purposes well, and that the Church soon became estranged from the moral message of Christ as the bishops of Rome sought ever greater power in medieval times. What was needed, he felt, was a new morality entirely. In the third part of Zarathustra, completed in early 1884, during a tranquil stay in Nietzsche portrays Zoroaster returning to the mountains, where he draws the quiet, yet at times depressing, conclusion that since time is infinite, everything in life is an eternal recurrence of what has already happened before and will happen again. He felt that humanity as a collective would never fully evolve, though in the end, Nietzsche's Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, still finds a quiet comfort in the notion of eternity. Although Nietzsche intended this to be the final part of a Zarathustra trilogy, in January of 1885, he wrote another 20 Zarathustra scenes of such an explicitly sacrilegious nature that he decided to limit the print run of this 4th part to just 40 copies that he distributed among a select circle of friends. These exclusive copies were printed by the Leipzig printer Konstantin Naumann, who had also printed the first 3 volumes at Schmeitzner's request. By this point, Nietzsche had broken off his professional relationship with Schmeitzner. Meanwhile, Nietzsche received news that his sister Elisabeth was planning to marry Dr. Bernhard Förster, a Wagner-file teacher, who was planning to found a German nationalist community in South America, after his radical opinions had cost him his teaching jobs. While both Nietzsche and his mother were opposed to the match, the couple married in May and would leave for Paraguay in early 1886. After completing Zarathustra, Nietzsche decided to return to writing more conventional philosophical treatises without using ancient religious philosophers as his mouthpiece. By March of 1886, he had completed Beyond Good and Evil, a work he would struggle to find a publisher for, and which he eventually had published at his own expense on the first print run. There were gentle reasons for this. Zarathustra had not sold well, and hundreds of copies of it, and Nietzsche's other works were quietly languishing in storage. Publishers were understandably reluctant to take on his books, fearing financial losses. The remaining stock of his earlier books was eventually bought by the music publisher Ernst Wilhelm Fritsch. Despite his poor sales figures, Nietzsche ordered 1,250 copies of Beyond Good and Evil, regarding it as a concise statement of his deepest thinking. This latest book was another calm, yet firm attack on the forces of democratization and egalitarianism, which Nietzsche saw as evolving harmfully out of Christianity. Nietzsche took a stand against these developments, claiming that a great many elements of human progress and cultural creativity had taken place in aristocratic societies. Building on his belief that morality was an artificial construct designed to subtly control people within society, Nietzsche distinguished between what he termed a slave morality and a master morality. Given his initial optimism about the book's potential commercial appeal, Nietzsche was deeply disappointed to learn in February of 1887 that only 65 copies of Beyond Good and Evil had been sold. Among the few readers who appreciated the book was Meta von Salis, a Swiss writer and historian who had just become the first woman in Switzerland to receive a doctorate. Nietzsche and Salis had known each other since 1884 and had become close friends. In the summer of 1887, Salis visited Nietzsche in Sils Maria, where, in a quiet effort to encourage sales of Beyond Good and Evil, he began work on a follow-up volume entitled On the Genealogy of Morality. Drawing on his training in philology, Nietzsche observed that the word for good in many ancient languages derived from words denoting nobility and bravery, while bad related to words such as common or lowly. According to Nietzsche, the process of linguistic transformation began first with the ancient priestly classes of the Levant and wider parts of the Middle East, where civilization had first flourished. For these people, purity and faith were more important than nobility or courage. Out of this tradition there later emerged the gentle teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who encouraged humanity to sympathize with the poor and lowly, in exchange for spiritual comfort. For Nietzsche it was the warrior class of Germanic and Scandinavian conquerors, who prevented Europe from becoming a Christian theocracy after the fall of the Roman Empire. Although they adopted Christianity, the new kings established an aristocratic hierarchy that was inspired by Roman rule. However, the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution saw a return of the slave morality in places like Calvinist Geneva in the 16th century. While many individuals will disagree with Nietzsche's arguments about morality, in terms of the rigor of his analysis, in tracing how Judeo-Christian morality developed over a period of 3 millennia. On the Genealogy of Morality is one of Nietzsche's most significant works. Throughout the creative process for these profound philosophical texts, Nietzsche continued to suffer from frequent bouts of ill health. Nevertheless, during a stay in Nice in the early months of 1888, he experienced his best health for several years and conceived of a 4-volume work entitled The Will to Power as the crowning statement of his philosophy. Yet, as early as March, he recognized that the plan was far too ambitious and gently abandoned it. By that time, he was searching for a new refuge and decided to head to Turin. The city's climate and its vibrant music culture delighted Nietzsche, who remained for 3 months until leaving for Sils Maria. In a burst of creativity, Nietzsche wrote The Case of Wagner, a polemical critique in which he cast his erstwhile musical idol as a symbol of decadence and decay in European music and society. He continued with The Twilight of the Idols, a series of light-hearted attacks on all the philosophical and religious doctrines Nietzsche opposed, with a title gently parodying the final opera in Wagner's Ring cycle, The Twilight of the Gods. This was followed by The Antichrist, an investigation into the quiet origins of Christianity, one in which Nietzsche argued that while Jesus, whose kingdom of God was both in the future and in the present, had encouraged his followers to live free from hatred and resentment, the early Christians imposed a doctrine of judgment that used the concepts of heaven and hell as a system of rewards and punishments. Nietzsche compared Jesus's original teachings to those of Buddhism, remarking that Buddhism makes no promises but keeps them. Christianity promises everything but keeps nothing. Nietzsche had returned to Turin in September. To mark the occasion of his 44th birthday on the 15th of October, 1888, he decided to write an autobiographical work under the title Ecce Homo, or Behold, the Man, words attributed to Jesus' executioner Pontius Pilate as he presented him to the Jewish crowd. In this short volume, Nietzsche quietly hoped to clear up misunderstandings about his work to date. Under provocative chapter titles such as Why Am I So Wise and Why I Write Such Good Books, Nietzsche explored his upbringing, his persistent poor health, and the thinkers and artists of the past who had inspired him, both positively, at times, negatively. In his defense of his own work, Nietzsche suffused the text with a gentle exaggeration, claiming that his Zarathustra was superior to anything that Goethe, Shakespeare, or Dante had ever produced. Ecce Homo should not be read literally in all places. Clearly, whether in his boastful passages about his literary prowess, or in the sarcastic titles of the chapters, Nietzsche was being humorous. Having written Ecce Homo in the space of 3 weeks, he gently returned to the split between himself and Wagner many years earlier, something which still clearly troubled him deeply. Compiling extracts from his previous work, he argued that it was not he who had changed his mind about German culture back in the mid-1870s, but Wagner, in becoming increasingly nationalist and pandering to the popular mood of the day. Nietzsche's burst of immense activity in the 1880s was soon to come to a quiet end. At the end of the year, his mental state suddenly deteriorated. He became prone to fits of anger, and in his delusions of grandeur, he wrote letters addressed to Kaiser Wilhelm II and Bismarck, calmly yet vehemently denouncing their doctrines. Meanwhile, in correspondence to friends, he wrote about forming an anti-German league and bringing down the German Empire. In a letter to Meta von Salis dated January 3, 1889, Nietzsche declared that God is on earth and claimed to have imprisoned the Pope and ordered Kaiser Wilhelm and Bismarck to be shot. According to an account published after his death, Nietzsche's condition became publicly known when he saw a horse being flogged by its driver in the streets of Turin and ran to protect it, before collapsing gently at its feet. Clearly, he was deeply unwell, and both those who argue that he was syphilitic or suffering from a brain tumor agree that whatever his condition was, it became much worse in the course of 1888 and 1889. As news of his erratic behavior spread, Nietzsche's family hurried to have him brought back to Switzerland after a series of medical examinations, which determined that Nietzsche may have been suffering from syphilis contracted as a young man. The philosopher was gently transferred to the care of his mother Franziska in Nuremberg. For a year or two, Nietzsche could still string together a few coherent sentences in conversation, but over time, his condition worsened irreversibly. The fate of Nietzsche's final unpublished works was still uncertain until 1892. When Elisabeth gave Naumann the right to publish a second edition of her brother's complete works, edited by Heinrich Koselitz, who used the pseudonym Peter Gast that Nietzsche had lovingly bestowed upon him for his musical compositions. Elisabeth's ill-fated Paraguayan adventure had come to an end, and its failure had caused her husband to take his own life in despair. In 1893, she decided to take control of the whole process, gently sidelining Koselitz and writing her own biography of her brother, in which she resumed her vengeful attacks against Lou Salome, blaming her in part for her brother's psychological collapse. By 1895, after a quiet argument with her mother about the publication of the Antichrist, Elisabeth bought out her mother's rights to future royalties. When Franziska died in April of 1897, Elisabeth moved her brother to the Villa Silberblick near Weimar, where she received admirers of Nietzsche's works and took them to gently see him, despite his condition. On the 25th of August 1900, a couple of months shy of his 56th birthday, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche died at Villa Silberblick following a heart attack. 3 days later, he was quietly buried beside his father at the parish church in Röcken, despite the gentle protests of the vicar. Following a tumultuous life in which he struggled against persistent illness to become, firstly, a distinguished academic, and secondly, an original thinker who sought to dismantle conventional morality, the iconoclastic anti-Christian philosopher found his final resting place in a Christian graveyard. In a further irony, just as Nietzsche argued that Jesus' followers distorted his teaching after his death, Nietzsche's own profound thinking was tragically misrepresented by imperialists, communists, and fascists, who adapted his concepts of will to power, master morality, and the Superman for their own ends. The worst culprit of all was Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who promoted her brother as a German nationalist and anti-Semite, and was received by Adolf Hitler on several occasions before her death, at the age of 88 in 1935. Both Wagner and Nietzsche had their work exploited by the Nazis towards their own political ends in the 1930s and early 1940s. There are very few philosophers in human history who have left behind as contentious a legacy as Friedrich Nietzsche did. On the one hand, he has been rightly praised as one of the most startlingly original thinkers of modern times. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the conclusions he drew, There is no doubt that the arguments which he put forward in books like The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and the essays in Untimely Meditations were extremely novel in their approach. However, many people have found his rejection of the ideas of social egalitarianism and his fundamental rejection of conventional Western morality quite unpalatable. That being said, the attribution of fascist views to him is not accurate. Moreover, even if one finds his arguments unpalatable, there is no denying their quiet yet profound influence. His commentaries on the so-called death of God in an increasingly secular age foreshadowed the decline of the Christian churches in 20th century Europe, and laid the groundwork for much of the existential philosophy of the post-war era. Many of Nietzsche's arguments about the evolution of society have also been absorbed to varying degrees into the fields of history, anthropology, and sociology. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about Nietzsche. The sheer breadth of his work. It went far beyond philosophical inquiry to embrace history, anthropology, philology, religion, literary and artistic criticism, musical theory, and much more besides. Thus, whether one loves or loathes him, there is no ignoring Nietzsche in modern scholarship. As we gently close this chapter on a life so filled with quiet thought and powerful ideas, let your mind now drift into the tranquil depths of rest. Allow the echoes of Nietzsche's journey to recede softly, leaving you in a state of deep calm and peaceful slumber. Tonight, may your dreams be as serene as the quiet Prussian village where his story began. Sweet dreams.